Okay, now here's advice that you've probably heard of a lot before. You've probably heard this about 100 times before. It's advice, though, that's often given by people who don't have a clue about how to evaluate a good track record. They give the advice to look for a fund with a good track record, but they don't know the first thing about evaluating a fund's track record. So we need to talk about track record from a truth standpoint, because sometimes the track records that you read are misleading. And the first thing that I want to look at is the difference between average versus actual rate of return. Now, this is a concept that you've got to understand. And let me illustrate an example of this. Let's say that you have a mutual fund. Let's say you bought a mutual fund, you put $10,000 in a mutual fund, and you kept your fingers crossed and you hoped over the first year you get a good rate of return. Well, let's say you did. Let's say you get a great rate of return. Let's say your fund went up 100% your first year. Well, that would mean that your fund is now worth $20,000, right? Because you invested $100,000 a year ago. You have a 100% rate of return. That means your account doubles to $20,000. And let's say you hope for the second year that you also get a great return like you did the first year. But let's say the return isn't so great. And let's in fact say it's terrible. Let's say it goes down 50%. Well, if your fund or your investment goes down 50% the second year, the account value would be now worth 10 grand, right? Because your 20,000 went down 50%, it's now worth 10,000. And if I asked you, what's your rate of return? What have you earned on this investment? You wouldn't even need a calculator to tell me that your rate of return is 0%, right? You started with 10,000, you still have 10,000, your return is 0. But the question I have for you is, what's the fund company going to report as their rate of return on the mutual fund? And this is where this looks completely different, because what a mutual fund company does is they add up the two years that the fund has been around. 100% plus minus 50% is equal to 50%, right? And they divide that over the period that we're talking about, which is 2 years. And that gives them a calculation, and they can report that their average rate of return is 25%. Now, your actual rate of return is 0. The fund company reports an average rate of return of 25%. So you need to understand not only actual and look at actual rates of return, but you need to look at average rates of return too. You need to look at both of them to understand what's really going on. Now let's look at average rate of return and annual rates of return, because these can look a little bit misleading too. Let's take an investment. Let's say you're looking at an investment, you do some research, or your financial advisor does some research, brings in a mutual fund up to you and says, look, here's a mutual fund that's got a great 5-year track record. It's got a 5-year average of 20%. What that means is that over the last 5 years, this mutual fund is averaged 20% positive return each year. Now you could look at that and go, wow, that's a great track record. That's what I want. But you might be missing something that's really important, and that's its annual returns. And here's why. If we take a look at this investment from an annual return perspective, it could have received in the first year, it could have got 100% in the first year and earned 0% in every year after that. So it went up 100% the first year and did nothing for the last 4 years. Now, it still has an average track record of 20%. But all of a sudden, it doesn't look so attractive anymore, does it? Because do you really want to buy a mutual fund that hasn't done a thing for the last 4 years? But you would never know that if all you do is look at its average return. Now, I want to talk about annualized returns. And I want you to be very careful of investments that are reporting a period of less than 1 year. So, an annualized rate of return is a return, as I said, that it's a projected return that's calculated from a period of less than 1 year. So let's take a mutual fund that's brand new. Let's say it's 1 month old, and let's say that over this month that this mutual fund has been around, the fund went up 1%. Had a good month. It went up 1% in its first month of existence. A mutual fund company could now advertise that this fund has an annualized rate of return of 12%. Now, they have to tell you that it's an annualized return. It's not an actual return. It's not an average return. It's a hypothetical return. They have to tell you this. But they typically do this with an asterisk. And whenever you come across an annualized rate of return, I want you to ignore it because it's completely meaningless. Now, track record itself. Track record is the historical performance of a mutual fund. And what you know already is that past performance is not necessary indicative of future returns. But past performance is still one of the best tools we have to predict the future. But the key to using track record when making investment decisions is to understand what the numbers are telling us. While the fund earns a rate of return and the numbers get stored in the fund's history forever, a fund's historical performance numbers tell us much more about the people running the fund than the fund itself. Because mutual funds are managed by people, and it's people that earn the numbers, either good or bad. But the numbers stick with the fund, even when the people responsible for the numbers have left. What that means is that you should always focus on the manager, not the fund. You should always pay attention to the person running the fund. That's more important than the fund itself. Now, this is more difficult than it might seem because fund managers move around. They might manage this fund for a little while, then they manage that fund. So when looking at a fund's long-term track record, all of the performance data is irrelevant if the management team has recently left. Don't focus on a mutual fund's track record, focus on the manager's track record. So you have to ask questions. Either ask your advisor or your financial planner if the mutual fund has had a recent manager change, or you can even ask the fund manager himself. You can call up a fund manager or email fund managers of any Canadian mutual fund and ask them for their own personal track record, not the track record of the fund they're managing, but their track record. Now, obviously, if a fund manager's been with a mutual fund for 10 years, he's been managing or she's been managing that mutual fund for 10 years, that 10-year track record the mutual fund has is attributable to that particular manager. But it's seldom that you're going to find a manager that's been with a fund for 10 years. So you need to find out the track record of the manager. Either ask your advisor or ask your financial planner, or you can ask the portfolio manager, the mutual fund manager himself or herself. And I don't want you to be shy about it. Mutual fund managers know what their track records are. They know their history. They should be proud of their own track records, and they should be willing and eager to provide it to you.